Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Examining Diversity in COVID-19 Clinical Trials. My name is Sydney Enland, and I am a policy specialist in NCSL's health program, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we introduce our speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in the chat box on your screen. To begin building some comfortability with the chat function, and also to learn who is on the line today, I invite you to type in the state from which you are calling from right now. We will hold a formal Q&A after our presenters are finished presenting. I want to briefly mention the resources. Above the presentation, you will see a couple tabs with one of them labeled Resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of the PowerPoint, as well as some other handouts. Another tab labeled Speaker, where you can read the bio of today's speakers. You can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. The webinar platform we are using is optimized for use in Google Chrome. While other web browsers such as Firefox may work, we recommend anyone experiencing technical difficulties try signing in through Chrome instead. If you continue to experience technical issues, please email registration@ncsl.org, where our team is ready to assist you. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the week. I would also like to thank Novartis for their support of this webinar. Our experts joining us today are Dr. George Mensah, Director at the Center for Translation Research and Implementation Science at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at the National Institutes of Health. Our second speaker is Badri Srinivasan, Head of Global Development Operations with Novartis. NCSL is the nation's bipartisan membership organization representing all 50 states and the territories and over 7,000 state legislators and over 30,000 legislative staff. So again, we are here today to talk about diversity in clinical trials. Finding a safe and effective treatment for COVID-19 remains a top priority for policymakers in the U.S. As the nation comes closer to a vaccine, many individuals have volunteered to join clinical trials. However, racial and ethnic minority groups have historically been underrepresented in these trials. During this webinar, we'll hear from experts on how clinical trials operate, current COVID-19 clinical trials, and efforts to include broader demographics in the research. State legislators across the country have increasingly become interested in this topic broadly, and since the COVID-19 pandemic began, there has been a particular interest in diversity in clinical trials as the infection, hospitalization, and death rates for COVID-19 in the United States are significantly higher for Black, Hispanic, American Indian, and Alaska Native populations. A clinical trial is a research study on human patients to test the safety and effectiveness of new treatments. These trials offer patients access to new and potentially life-saving drugs and cures. More than half of the states have enacted laws to mandate the coverage of, or insurers have agreed to cover, clinical trials. Several states have enacted legislation related to clinical trials this year. For example, Colorado enacted a bill called Equity and Access to Clinical Trials in Medicaid. The act authorizes the state Medicaid program to cover routine costs associated with phase 1 through phase 4 clinical trials involving the prevention, detection, diagnosis, or treatment of life-threatening or debilitating diseases or conditions. Illinois revised provisions relating to the Health Information Exchange Authority, providing that persons who are not otherwise eligible for medical assistance but may qualify for the duration of the coronavirus emergency shall be limited to certain products and services, and provides for coverage of clinical trials. Kentucky has appropriated money to the Kentucky Pediatric Cancer Research Trust Fund for research and support of expansion of clinical trials. Now let's move into the presentations by our experts. First up, we have Dr. George Mensah. In his current role at NIH, Dr. Mensah leads an integrative trans-institute effort to advance the translation of scientific discoveries in heart, lung, and blood diseases research to clinical and public health practice nationally and globally. Dr. Mensah's primary focus is in the application of implementation and system science approaches to address research translation gaps in order to maximize health impact in the prevention and treatment of heart, lung, and blood diseases and the elimination of health inequities. Dr. Mensah is a clinician, scientist trained in internal medicine and the subspecialty of cardiovascular diseases. His professional experience includes 17 years of public service between the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. His bio is available under the Bios tab. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Mensah. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Sydney. I really appreciate the introduction, and thank all of you for making time to listen to us. I must tell you, agreeing to participate in this webinar was very easy because I recall 2 decades ago in a previous life when I worked at the CDC, the NCSL was a major partner, and you were actually very, very effective in helping us when we put together the state-based heart disease and stroke prevention program. So thank you very much. I remember the last time I spoke with you was 16 years ago. So hopefully I will be in touch more often, and I wouldn't have to wait another 16 years to speak with you. So a big thank you, and I bring you greetings from the leadership at NIH, in particular Dr. Francis Collins, who has been very, very passionate about our scientific response to this COVID pandemic. I was very delighted to hear what Sydney went through in terms of the legislation and the laws that you've passed in your states. And again, a big thank you for that. We know there's a lot that you can do. In my portion of the presentation, I'll try to answer these 5 questions that you see here. I've actually put in more slides only for your benefit, so I know you have access to it and you can go to each one later on. So I do not intend to spend a lot of time on each slide. I really want to make sure we save enough time for questions. So I'll go ahead and begin with the first question. What are clinical trials and why are these clinical trials important? As Sydney mentioned in the introduction, it's fairly simple by way of definition. A clinical trial is a type of research or experiment that is done in people for 2 main reasons: to determine if an intervention is safe and if it is effective. And these interventions can be drugs or they can be tests. But the most important message on this slide is safety is the #1 priority in a clinical trial, even before we ask the question, is it effective? The other bullets listed give you a sense of some of the assurances we provide. For example, before even anyone begins to participate, the entire set of risks and the benefits of the trial are explained, and then they sign an informed consent. That is the process to make sure that volunteers don't have any questions. And there are very rigorous ethical standards that every researcher must follow. And again, importantly, the participant is at will to stop participation at any time. So safety is critical. You very often hear of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and they are important. But in this chart, I want to show you in the very left bar shows that there are a lot of studies that are done just to make sure that working in animals, we can at least have some assurance of safety before you even start thinking of clinical trials. Once that is completed, and we are sure that the vaccine or drug we have has been proven safe in animals, then we begin a phase 1 trial. where we need only about 20 to 80 people. And there the question is it safe in healthy humans? That can be completed within 6 months to a year. Once that is successful, we go into a phase 2 trial. The bottom part of the chart shows the relative numbers of people you need in each of these phases. So in a phase 1 trial where you need only about 20 to 80, in a phase 2 trial, you certainly need more than that. It can be a few dozen to several hundreds. And about a third of these trials progress into a phase 3. The one that you most likely hear about more often is the phase 3 trial, where the question we're asking is the efficacy and the effectiveness of the intervention. And there you need a lot more people, can be hundreds to thousands. And the number of people you have in there also determines how quickly you can get some of your results. We might get back to this during the question and answer period. So each trial before the vaccine or the drug gets to the FDA for approval in the United States must complete these 3 phases and demonstrate safety first and demonstrate effectiveness. It's important that we highlight in diversity and inclusion in clinical trials because that is really, really critical. Because to find a vaccine or drug that is safe and effective in all kinds of people, it makes sense that it be tested in all kinds of people. So clinical trials that include men and women from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds give us a much greater assurance that it will be safe and effective in both men and women in people from diverse backgrounds. So ideally, these trials, for example, for COVID-19 vaccine, are best designed when they enroll participants from communities that have been hardest hit by the pandemic, because obviously when we have an effective vaccine, this is a community we also want to make sure we get to so we can save the most lives. This slide shows you some of the reasons why it's important to pay attention to underserved racial and ethnic communities that have been hit really hard by this pandemic. For example, when you look at in the communities of African Americans, even though they make up only 13% of the U.S. population, they contribute about 20% of the cases and about as much in terms of proportion of deaths. For Hispanics and Latinos, though they make up only 18%, they contribute about 32% of the cases. Same hard-hit impact when you look at American Indian and Alaska Natives. Almost 4 to 5 times greater risk of being hospitalized from COVID-19 than whites. The reason why, in spite of these challenging numbers, we've historically had difficulty enrolling African Americans, Hispanics, and American Indian and Alaska Natives is because of their exclusion in previous trials and also in cases where they have been exploited. And so we're dealing with a major problem of distrust, mistrust, in addition to misinformation. And that's why it's important that we tackle this head on. Now, the problem of the lack of diversity in clinical trials is not a new problem. We've known about it for a while. And in the next few slides, I want to show you just some examples, not in COVID, but to show you that they exist in heart disease, they exist in stroke research, and certainly in cancer research. This is an excellent research study that was published in the major journal, the New England Journal of Medicine. And as you see here, it was testing 2 drugs that are being examined for safety and effectiveness in kidney cancer. And if you look in this, the diagram to the right that shows the total, although about 720 people were recruited into both trials, there are only 5 people recruited who were Black, and all other racial and ethnic groups, about 22. About 74 Asian. So this is only one example showing that it's a real challenge in addressing disparity. One of the main questions you wanted us to address is the extent of racial and ethnic diversity in the current vaccine trials. And obviously, the most current real-time data you can only access from the company's website. But at least there is an NIH-funded group that is called COVID-19 Prevention Network, or CoVPN. And they have a registry where they track people who have volunteered for trials. So I'm showing you two types of bars. The darker cyan or green bar is the data on race, ethnicity in the registry, and in the lighter green of each couple of bars is the first one, the lighter green. That's the race ethnic proportion in the particular trial. So for the AstraZeneca vaccine trial, for example, at the time this was done, about 80% of the people in the registry as well as people in the trial were white. If you ask how many were Hispanic, less than 10%, both in the registry as well as in the trial itself. For Black or African Americans was less than 5%. That picture is the same when you look in the Johnson vaccine trial and you look at the Moderna vaccine trial. I'll have a little bit more to share with you on more recent data for the Moderna vaccine trial. The important message from what we know, given the three slides I shared with you, but also the lack of diversity in clinical trials, whether it's cancer or diabetes or heart disease and stroke, a few things. One is that the misconception that minorities in general don't like to participate in trials, so let's not waste time there, is a real misconception, because there have been very good trials, well done trials, that have showed that minorities actually are just as willing to participate if you take the time to explain, take the time to respect, take the time to pay attention to culture and environmental issues. They participate just as well, and I have an example to share with you. It's also important to dismiss the notion that minorities are not interested in research. In general, they are, when given the right information, when reached using the right media, the right channels, we can have success in recruiting and enrolling them in trials. So what we've learned is that our approaches need to be modified so that simply having a website and asking people to go to the website or distributing leaflets may not be adequate. We need to use targeted, directed messages and trusted messengers. So it's really, really critical to address institutional mistrust as opposed to automatically just saying they don't want to participate and then moving on. This is the specific example I wanted to share with you. I'm showing you data from the Moderna phase 3 vaccine trial, the most recent 4 weeks from August 31st through last week, September 21. And the example here is prior to August, meaning the first 4 weeks after launch, the proportion of African Americans enrolling, shown in blue, was only 4 or 5%. Hispanics was only around 10%, so it was very low. They did all the right things, began engaging using appropriate public service announcements, appropriate targeted messages, using trusted voices in the communities, and in the last 4 weeks, you've seen the gradual increase, African Americans going from 5% in July to 9%, 10%. Actually, the African Americans shown in blue, and most recently, almost 30% in the last week of sampling. Same thing for Hispanics, went from under 10% to 17%, 23%, 31%, most recently 42%. So when you take the right steps and you use the right and appropriately targeted engagement and outreach, you can have success in recruiting African Americans. This is a very simple slide to show you what NIH is doing. We have an active community engagement alliance that's addressing misconceptions around COVID disparities. The two main objectives are to use strategies that have been shown to be effective in community engagement and outreach that we can specifically target misinformation and mistrust and promote and facilitate inclusion in clinical trials. In the next slide, I just want to show you, to make it easier for those who want to access information, putting as much of our trusted information in one place as possible, one single website, covid19community.nih.gov, and you get access to all the information that we have available. In addition, we've leveraged all the years of experience from HIV vaccine trials, other vaccine trials, and other infectious disease trials to put together the COVID-19 Prevention Network. This is their website shown in the bottom right, and they provide similarly very useful information, as well as an opportunity for individuals to volunteer for the research. I'll finish up by dwelling on this slide for just a minute, because this is critical. We know there is a lot that NCSL can do as you as individual state legislators, as well as your legislatures can do. Definitely highlighting the mechanisms we have in place at the state level as well as the federal level that ensure safety, and emphasize that safety is the #1 priority is key. All of you are trusted voices in your community, and we need your help to emphasize the importance of this work, the importance of science, the importance of research, so that you can direct and help people, lead them to trustworthy sources of information about COVID-19. Communicating the need to involve people who are most impacted, whether we're talking of the elderly, those over age 65, as well as Native or Indigenous people, African Americans or Blacks, Hispanic and Latino, these communities that have been hardest hit, doing all you can to engage them in this effort will be really, really worth it. Certainly supporting policies and legislation in your state that are based on scientific evidence would be crucial. And helping us all work together to promote health equity for all and address structural racism and all forms of institutionalized discrimination and barriers that stand in the way of participation will be crucial. This final slide provides several of the links that can lead to trustworthy information. All of you, you're paying the taxpayers' dollars that support us, and we're very grateful for that. So these are the sources I've listed for NIH as well as CDC, and you, of course, know of other sources of trustworthy information. So I will stop there and say, if you need more detailed information on diversity in clinical trials, the FDA has a wonderful resource. Here's the website. It provides at least the last 3 to 5 years of how we're doing in diversity in drug trials. And at NIH, we also provide on the right side, I've shown you the web link that tells you about how we do in the research we fund in terms of inclusion of women and minorities, as well as inclusion of individuals across the lifespan. And I'm going to stop there, but a big thank you. Here are all the colleagues with whom I spoke, and I want to give them credit for it. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to you, Sydney. And by the way, I figured out how to mute myself, so I will go on mute now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Mensah. That was a really great presentation. I do want to invite any of our participants to use the chat function to submit any questions. So right now we are going to go to our next speaker. We have Badri Srinivasan. He's the head of Global Development Operations at Novartis. Badri has more than 25 years of experience in clinical trial design and execution. Badri works on removing obstacles, fostering innovation and data-driven decision-making, and harnessing the collective energy of teams for effective collaboration. Much of his work has been on challenging and disrupting assumptions and ways of working better to serve patients. He has worked in the industry with over 25 years of experience. Badri, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Sydney. And thank you, Dr. Mensah, for a fantastic presentation. I will attempt to build on Dr. Mensah's presentation and provide a little bit more color into clinical trials, challenges, addressing diversity, and then obviously looking for all of your help. It's delighted to be here, delighted to be with you all. Very important group. You have a lot of influence and can indeed influence a lot in how we not only do clinical trials, but do good with clinical trials with the right population in there. Um, the flow of my presentation, I will introduce a little bit of Novartis to you, and then also the particular division that I run, which runs all the clinical trials in Novartis, Global Development Operations. Talk to you a little bit about challenges in recruiting clinical trials, and also from a diversity perspective. Talk a little bit about our COVID response, how Novartis responded to COVID. We'll give you a little bit of a snapshot into how companies like us responded to COVID, what we are doing about diversity, which also then broaches a broader topic of diversity, and then hopefully we'll end with seeking your help and participation going forward. We go to the next slide. Let me use this to introduce Novartis. Novartis is we are one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. I'm sure you all have heard about it. We have pretty broad and diverse portfolio of medicines that we develop at any given point in time. As of right now, for example, we're in about 50 different disease areas addressing unmet need in those 50 different disease areas. In the US, we have about 15,000 associates who work in Novartis. We have, in the past 5 years or so, about 300,000 patients have received free medication from the Novartis Patient Assistance Foundation. We invest somewhere of the order of about $4 billion annually globally in research and development, all towards finding medicines, towards finding cures. And we've supported over about 500,000 patients through our copay assistance program. That's just a broad brush of Novartis and some key statistics there. Global Development Operations, which you see on the right of the slide, is the division within Novartis that runs all of our clinical trials globally. We are in about 60 countries, in about 5 hubs in about 60 countries. Pretty diverse portfolio. I won't go through the numbers below, but suffice it to say we run about 500 or so clinical trials annually and touch about 100 to 150,000 patients, about 20,000 medical investigators on an annual basis. I have the privilege of running that organization. I spent a lot of time in the US. I'm now based in Basel, Switzerland, which is the headquarters of Novartis. But 20 plus years of my life was spent in the US, primarily in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I went to school and then subsequently worked in a number of companies over there. This essentially, hopefully, gives you a frame for what Novartis is and what the particular division that I run in Novartis is. If you go to the next slide, I want to key off of what Dr. Mensah said. Clinical trials are a pretty complicated set of activities. Drug development in general is a trial and error activity. We know a lot about the human body and the biology of the human body, but yet what we know is very little of what there is to know. And every day, new discoveries, every day we're finding out more. And inherent to that is the challenge of running clinical trials. And I want to showcase to you some of the trial and recruitment challenges, because that can then juxtapose against the particular challenges of diversity we have, and probably adds a little bit more color to that as well. Typically, from beginning to end, from when something enters phase 1, as Dr. Mensah showed in his slides, to when it goes for registration, gets approved, phase 3, and then for approval to the FDA, can be a long time. It can be about 10 to 12 to 14 years before something traverses that journey going from phase 1 to phase 3. And that is both a journey that has a high probability of failure, as well as is a costly process. If I look at just some of the statistics here from a trials perspective, Tufts University does repeat analysis, the number of analysis on how clinical trials are executed, how productive they are, et cetera, et cetera. In 2020, Tufts analysis found that the average time to conduct studies increased by about 5 months compared to the previous periods of 2008 to 2013 or 2014 to 18. And this is despite regulatory approval process actually getting shorter. So on the one hand, we have the regulators being very efficient at what they do, or getting more and more efficient, but yet, if you will, the trial conduct time continues to go up. And that's partly also because of the complexity of running these trials and the challenges of running these trials. As we go into more targeted therapies, as we go into situations that are not the low-hanging fruit, as it were, it becomes obviously harder and harder. Harder to find the patient population, harder to conduct these trials, and also a higher rate of failure. If you look at the overall success rate for when something enters phase 1 and all the way through to actual approval, that success rate is somewhere around 14%. So we have essentially a pipe that has obviously clearly more failures than successes, but that is the nature of drug development. If you look on the recruitment side, on the other hand, of all of the patients eligible to participate in trials, somewhere between 2 and 5% of patients actually participate in trials. Now, this is pertinent because the more we increase diversity in trials, the more we go to populations that we are today not including in trials, the more is our ability to not only conduct the right trial, but also have more participants into the trial. And if you look at the amount of US trials that fail to meet their recruitment deadlines, 80% of trials today, in one way, shape, or form, do not actually meet their original commitment of timelines or recruitment goals, if you will, which again contributes to that 5 months increase that we are seeing in time to conduct a study. So the reason I wanted to share some of these statistics with you is to underscore the fact that it is a pretty complex environment that we are getting into. And then into this environment, if you will, we have a situation of diversity that is not right as well. As Dr. Mensah said, African Americans constitute about 13.5 to 14% of the population, but less than 9% actually participate in trials. Then there are disease differences as well. If you look at mortality rates for liver cancer, if you look at kidney cancer, as Dr. Mensah showed in his presentation, mortality rates for liver cancer, for example, is twice as high in the Hispanic population or the Hispanic Latino population. So we know that minority groups not only are underrepresented in trials, but they also have a different expression of the disease, which we need to study. And we need to understand why that is the same. If you look at asthma, for example, you have in the same population, if you take mortality rates for regular asthma patients and the rate for children, it's 10 times higher. If you look at various cancers, for example, the higher risk is expressed even something like 40%, 50% higher in either African American or Hispano-Latino population. So it becomes critical for us to understand why these differences exist, include them in clinical trials, study them in clinical trials, and ensure that the clinical trials are representative of the population that drug is meant to serve. Otherwise, we have a situation where we have drugs that get approved, and perhaps we think that it is applicable to the population when it may not be. And then we have post-marketing safety concerns, we have post-marketing investigations we need to do, etc. Post-marketing investigations being investigations done after the drug gets approved. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor on not just on the challenges, on the recruitment, and on the diversity. Now, in addition to this, I'll say one more point before I move to the next slide. In addition to this, if you look at the cost of clinical trials, the cost of clinical trials has pretty much gone up substantially. In 2003, the total cost of bringing a medicine to patients was about $800 million. In 2018, that same number, that same figure stood at $2.6 billion, $800 million to $2.6 billion. again underscores the fact that we need to look at this challenge in a very different way and look at this in a very inclusive way. Going to the next slide, I want to spend a few minutes here on COVID-19. And I want to spend a few minutes here on how we responded to COVID-19 from a Novartis perspective, because hopefully that'll give you a flavor for how the general response to COVID-19 was from pharmaceutical companies, but also then what specific efforts did we take to ensure that there was diversity in the COVID trials. Novartis does not have a vaccine division, so we do not develop vaccines, but we do develop therapeutics. So we are in drugs and medicines, and that is where we focus on. From a response perspective, even as COVID started to unfold in the February-March timeframe, it became clear that there were two things that was needed: speed and collaboration. Collaboration not just within a company, but collaboration across the entire ecosystem. We joined, for example, the active public-private partnership that NIH helped put in place as part of the NIH efforts to look at COVID and combat COVID. The Bill and Melinda Gates Therapeutic Accelerator was put in place, and we joined that, as well as did many pharmaceutical companies, to come together to collaborate on how we could respond to the COVID pandemic. There were a number of direct partnerships organized by institutes such as the Innovative Medicines Initiative, again, which brought a number of pharmaceutical companies together in order to provide a combined collaborative response. Not only was it COVID, but also what is the intervention we need? What is the science we need to look at the entire coronavirus? University of California, Berkeley, put together a collaborative drug discovery effort, which again, a number of pharmaceutical companies, including Novartis, joined. For us, in addition, we launched a not-for-profit portfolio of medicines of about 15 generics that we had through our Sandoz division, and made that available for low and lower middle-income countries. Now, from a clinical trials perspective, what we wanted to do was make sure that we looked at our portfolio of medicines that we had, of therapies we had, and tried to understand what is the ones that could actually help with the COVID pandemic and bring that to clinical trials and bring that to an approval pathway as fast as possible. So with that in mind, we started 3 clinical trials on this, obviously with the need for speed and fast recruitment. And we collaborated and participated with a number of partnerships or number of entities, like the AIDS Clinical Trials Group. We then used the Johns Hopkins University data to do community outreach in affected areas. For this, in order to ensure diversity, we also focused in the US on locations with dense and diverse patient populations. Areas in New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Missouri, Georgia, Washington, D.C., Ohio. These were areas we went into deliberately to ensure that our representation of diversity in the clinical trials was good, robust, and appropriate. We also took steps to ensure that the site personnel that were involved in the clinical trials also had not only diversity, but also a good background and a diverse background. We had 40% female clinical investigators, 21% of which were non-white, and 32% of the males were non-white as well. That was important because it was important, as again Dr. Mensah mentioned, there is a trustworthy environment we need to create in order to enhance diverse participation in trials. And the way we do that, one of the ways at least we do that, is by starting with the people who are actually front and center interacting with the patients every day to make sure that there is a trusting relationship and there is a trusting way in which patients can come in and feel secure in these trials. Dr. Mensah again mentioned about informed consent. Informed consent is an instrument through which the patient or a caregiver looks at what they're about to get into in the clinical trials, understands the pros and cons of getting into those clinical trials, and walks in eyes wide open, as it were. And it was important for us to provide these informed consents in languages and in mediums that could be well understood by a diverse population. So we routinely provided these informed consents in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, many other languages, so that appropriate people from those backgrounds could participate. It's also important for us to ensure, as a community, ensure that patients have an easy way of participating in trials. Particularly with COVID, it became important to have the patients in there who felt secure in participating in these trials. Many of them couldn't leave their homes. Many of them couldn't go to their hospitals. So we provided telemedicine visits, home nursing wherever possible, reimbursement for travel so that they could take concierge service, etc., in order to come to the sites when and where they could come to the sites. And I highlight each of these because while we provided this for COVID, it's equally applicable in a non-COVID situation. And it's equally applicable to ensure across the board that each of these measures, each of these techniques, if you will, help increase diverse participation in trials. These were some of the ways in which we tried, with a focus on COVID, increase participation. Going to the next slide. I have a couple of slides, and I'm going to stop in the interest of time because we want to preserve some time for question and answers as well. Our efforts at diversity and inclusion essentially falls into 4 buckets. We are committed as a company to ensure diversity in clinical trials, not because we think that is going to make us look better or make us look as a company that is working with the community, but because it is the right thing to do, but because it is exactly what we want in clinical trials to ensure that the clinical trial is representative of the population that it is willing to and wanting to serve. So our commitment essentially is a commitment in culture, a commitment in strategic partnerships, in data and technology, and in processes and tools. And I'll take each of these for a few seconds to highlight what I mean by that. From a culture perspective, our intent and what we're working hard to do is to foster an inspired culture right from the beginning of ensuring patient diversity, inclusivity, thinking about the patient, putting yourself in the shoes of the patient from across all communities. That includes education, awareness programs, competency training, working with patient communities, community outreach programs, in order to make sure that we are well-versed, understand the needs of the patient from across a broad spectrum of a diverse population. From a partnership perspective, one of the things that is important, even as highlighted by COVID, and when I talked about all of the partnerships that happened when COVID started to come upon us, partnerships enhance our ability to reach into the population. Partnerships allow us to do more effectively what no single organization can do. Things like investigator training, things like building common recruitment methodologies, reaching into and creating these trustworthy entities, trustworthy folks with appropriate training who can go into the communities and enroll these patients. When we take a partnership approach, we feel that is much more strengthened, and it becomes a voice of the entire population rather than a single pharmaceutical company trying to do something. So we believe a lot in these strategic partnerships and have invested a lot and continue to invest a lot in these strategic partnerships. Data and technology, as with anything else, it is important for us to understand what is the problem we're facing. The data allows us to go in with appropriate interventions, understand what is the population prevalence, what should be the representation of African Americans, of Hispanics, etc. And then to understand how do we at least meet the population prevalence in our clinical trials. We ourselves within Novartis have about 2 million patient years of data that we've collected over time. And we use that to understand, before we actually go into a clinical trial, how exactly the diversity, the representation of various groups, ethnic groups, should look like in the clinical trials. We use a strategy which is a gender health equity strategy to understand how we need to go and how we need to populate these trials. We have a tool called Map of Life, which we've built, which allows us very quickly, for any given protocol, for any given program, a disease program, understand where should we go and how should we recruit these patients. Now, that's all great. It only comes to life if we actually practice it every day. And therein lies the processes and tools. What we are doing actively is embedding each of these interventions into how we conduct clinical trials just day to day. Diversity is not a special thing we should do every other week or on Fridays of the last Friday of the month or anything special. It should become part of the fabric of how we do clinical trials. And embedding it into our processes and our tools ensures that this is just the way we function. So that's really an overview of how we are attempting to put our efforts into diversity and inclusion and ensure that we have appropriate diversity in our clinical trials across the board. On the last slide, let me stay on this for a minute. When COVID came, before COVID, I would put it this way. Many of our actions in clinical trials were dictated by policy. Policies such as GCP policies, policies such as the guidance documents issued by the various regulatory authorities, what we needed to do, ICH, etc. When COVID happened and when speed was of the essence, practice in many cases overtook policy. Whereas policy used to dictate practice, with COVID, we were in a situation where we just needed to do what we needed to do to get ahead of the situation we're in. If we needed to do telemedicine, we just had to do it to ensure the safety of patients, to ensure that we serve the patient community well. And many times policies caught up after the fact to the practices that happened on the ground as a result or because of COVID. But what it showcased was the policy limitations that we were saying was simply artificial. Where there is a will, we actually can make things happen. And the regulators also saw that there was a way in which we could be very agile with the way we do this, with how we practice, as long as we are doing it within certain bounds and within certain norms. And we can work together, that it's not policy or practice, but it's actually policy and practice working together to achieve many of these solutions. I believe we are at a similar inflection point with regards to diversity. Diversity is not something we do and then afterwards claim, or diversity is not something we say is a problem and then find solution. Diversity and how we do this in clinical trials has to become part of the fabric of how we think about it, how we design trials, how we execute trials. And it has to be done collaboratively, just like pharmaceutical companies and regulators joined together from a COVID perspective. Here again, we as a community, I think, can join together, whether it be pharmaceutical companies, patient registries, patient groups, investigator groups, you all as legislators, we all come together and try to solve this collaboratively. I believe the power of that is when we do that together, we're able to travel further, travel faster, put in more lasting solutions, put in more solutions that really are meaningful on the ground. And I think that's what we're committed to. That's what I'm personally committed to. And I can say with all clarity that that's what Novartis is committed to as well. Thank you very much for the time. Thank you for listening to this presentation. And thanks for the opportunity to be here with you all today. Back over to you.
Thanks, Badri. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. I just wanted to let our audience know that since we did start a little late, we'll go over time. So if you are able to stay on the line for Q&A, that would be great. And as a reminder, if you have questions, please put them into the chat box. We have a few already in the chat box. One question is for Dr. Mensah on your slide 19 about what can NCSL and state legislators do. It would be great to drill down on more of an action plan and resources to address the areas that you reference on that slide. Do you have anything else to add, Dr. Mensah? Like if a state legislator wants to be more involved in the process, how would you recommend they get started, or who should they reach out to in their state?
Cindy, thank you very much. I think that's a very important question. We're happy when we see actions follow discussions. To the extent that we get approval, we'll be delighted to work with you. I think the process would be maybe a letter. If you send a letter to me, I'll be happy to direct it to our Office of Policy and Legislation. They would get the appropriate approval, and we can certainly work on this. Dr. Francis Collins has made it very clear that this is an all-hands-on-deck effort. Obviously, there's a great deal of benefit from working together, and I'll be delighted to follow up if you send an email, either through Sydney or through HHS or to NIH. It would get to me. I'm one of two staff who are co-leading the SEAL effort, and that's CEAL. It's a Community Engaged Alliance against COVID-19 disparities. So if we receive this through Sydney or another method, we'll be happy to follow up. Thank you.
Great. Another question. Where is a good place to get updates on clinical trials? Dr. Mensah, you provided a plethora of resources as well. And is it possible to know how they're working before the trial finishes? Dr. Mensah or Badri?
Very good question. Based on this presentation today, at least I know one place I can go. I'll go to Badri. but in addition, we recognize that it's very challenging, frankly, because every company has access to its own real-time data. You have to go to every company's website to get that. The good news is the NIH-funded COVID-19 Prevention Network, again, is CoVPN, C-O-V-P-N. If you Google that, you get that. They're working on trying to put together one website where you can go and have access. I know that Moderna has a site, and it's Moderna TX. If you type that in Google, it will bring up the website that shows you the week-by-week data, and it's actually, the link is on one of my slides, and I'll turn over to Badri for additional comments you have. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Mensah. Just two other points to the great information already provided by Dr. Mensah. One is you could go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is the FDA website, and it has a repository. All pharmaceutical companies register any trial that they start at that website, and it'll tell you what the status of this trial is as well. Is it recruiting? Is it closed? Is it just opening? Where is it? Which countries? Which states, etc. So that is another great source of information. Very easy to use. Got a lot of filters, search capabilities, etc. There's a second part to that question. Is it possible to know how they're working before the trial finishes? Let me answer in general. In any clinical trial these days, we have what are known as interim analyses. Interim analyses could be for a number of reasons. They're predominantly actually for ensuring that there is no safety concern. So a safety interim analysis is usually looked at by an independent board called a data safety monitoring board. And the data safety monitoring board looks at that data at pre-specified cut points or milestones, if you will, to look at that data and say, how are the patients doing? Now, built into that, or in some trials, we also have the ability to stop a trial for early evidence of efficacy as well. And so there is an ability to know. Most trials are blinded trials, so people don't, both the patients as well as the people conducting the trials do not know what particular treatment a patient is on, and that is to preserve the randomization, that is to preserve bias or make the trial unbiased, I should say. And so in that situation, if we were to find out that a trial is efficacious and we need to stop it because it makes no sense for people to, let's say, continue on a placebo or a comparator when we actually have evidence of efficacy, then that is one way to find out. Now, this is in general. Not all trials have this, but I've given this as a general kind of information. Sydney, back to you.
Great. I think we'll have time for just one more question. Are the number of people in the stages of clinical trials generally the same for all types of treatment and vaccines, or does that number vary?
Sydney, I'll be happy.
I'll go on after you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to tackle it. But before I answer that, I wanted to share with you that I put the link address in the chat box for clinicaltrials.gov. So if you go there, you'll be able to search for particular trials, just as Badri mentioned. The answer to your question is yes and no. The yes part is the numbers I showed on my slide are approximation. So when it says 60 to 100, depending on the trial for phase 1, they may use 60 people, another may use 100. But usually that range tends to be accurate. So if you look at a phase 3 trial, for example, and this is actually a very important question, for the Moderna trial, if you look on my slide and we say several hundreds to several thousand, there could be a phase 3 trial that's only enrolling 3,000 people. Depending on the condition that you're developing the drug or the vaccine for, you may have to wait 2 or 3 years before you have enough events happen to determine whether the drug or vaccine was effective. So instead of enrolling 1,000 people, if you enroll 30,000 people, meaning you have the resources to do that, you may not have to wait 3 years, but you could get enough events in just 1 year. So the two-part answer is the numbers are approximate, but in general, if you have the resources, you can enroll a whole lot more and you're likely to get results faster. That is how we are able to accelerate the vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine trials without sacrificing safety. The Moderna trial is enrolling 30,000, whereas in the past, a trial like that might have enrolled only 1,000 or 2,000. Thank you.
Great. Badri, did you have anything else to add?
No, nothing. I think that was a super comprehensive answer. Nothing more to add.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. We'd like to extend a final thank you to our presenters. We greatly appreciate the expertise each of you were able to provide for wonderful presentations. I would again like to thank Novartis for their support of this webinar, and thank you to our attendees for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, the recording of today's webinar and the slides will be available on NCSL's website within the week. Thank you very much for attending and hope you all have a great day.
Thank you for having us.
Great. Thank you very much to all of you. Have a safe evening. Bye-bye.